Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klender, and today's episode number 51, is bittersweet. It's one of my favorite podcasting conversations with two of my favorite podcast producing clients about quite possibly the podcasting work I am most personally proud of. And also the project that has led to the most professional and personal growth for me as a podcast producer, editor, and consultant. Key Change, creating opera for all voices from the Santa Fe Opera, hosted by Andrea Fellows Walters and Brandon Neal, has been my growing edge, testing all kinds of creative, administrative, and editorial boundaries. I have never been more challenged or had more fun making podcasts. But this episode isn't just for me, and it's certainly not about me. This is for you, the company leader who is dreaming of a podcast for your organization. This is for you, the individual within an organization charged with producing your company's podcast. This is for you, the entrepreneur or solopreneur who is planning a podcast to elevate your brand. This is for you, the change maker with a message you need to share with the people who need to hear it. This is for you, the podcaster struggling to be heard over the noise, to stand out from a sea of podcasts in a unique and authentic way. I think you get the point. Now, back to what I said in the beginning, this conversation with Andrea and Brandon is bittersweet because one of the things I love most, and I've always felt is the secret sauce of Key Change, and that we talk about in this episode, is the relationship between the two co-hosts. The dynamic, the improvisational interplay between them, and yes, even sometimes the dramatic tension. Because, and here's a podcast production secret, when you have two co-hosts with exactly the same point of view, who agree about everything, it's boring. There's no point. And now, as I'm recording this intro, we are about to go into production for season 3. And honestly, I debated about whether to tell you this up front or whether to wait until after you hear the interview, but I feel it's only right to disclose right away. Season 3 will not be featuring Brandon as a co-host. Fear not, it's for a wonderful reason, which is that he has accepted a new role as the associate producer in the office of the president at the Juilliard School of Music in New York City, and hence is no longer at the Santa Fe Opera. We are so proud of Brandon and excited to see what this new role will hold for him at a brand new position at the school in an ever-changing arts and entertainment landscape. So, what do you do when you've built an entire show around a personality, around the chemistry between two personalities, and then one ingredient of that magical elixir is gone? We did not know this was going to happen when we recorded this interview, and we already feel a great wide open vacuum without him. Needless to say, the show must go on, and needless to say, it will not be the same Key Change. But nevertheless, Andrea and I are excited and a little nervous to seize the opportunity for the show to grow in a new and unexpected way. I mean, the word is in the podcast title itself, Key Change, the only constant. Show notes for this episode, including specific resources and episodes referenced, will be in the description in your app and at thecreativeimpostor.com/podenvy051. Also, you will be hearing us referencing someone named Cabby multiple times throughout. This is our incredible audio producer and engineer based in Santa Fe. Our show would not sound as good as it does without him and his infinite patience during our largely improvised voiceover recording sessions. More on that later. You'll find Cabby Sound Studios also linked in the show notes at thecreativeimpostor.com/051. Okay, without further ado, Andrea Fellows Walters and Brandon Neal from Key Change, creating opera for all voices. Andrea Fellows Walters, Brandon Neal, thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Envy. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Super happy to be talking to you.
I know. I'm super happy to be actually talking and engaging with you rather than just listening intently.
And being the voice in our heads.
I don't know if either of you have ever had the experience of being a teacher and then having student feedback forms.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I feel right now, because I'm going to ask you some questions about what it's like to work with me, which is a really weird thing to do.
Oh, goody.
We'll be very honest.
Yes, please be very honest.
Oh, my God. I was going to hold back, but you want us to be honest?
No,
okay, we're going to be honest.
We gotta be honest.
No, I do want honesty. And the reason why I wanted to have you on the show is because what I find really interesting is that the two of you came to me and you had a very grand vision for what you wanted. I remember a conversation downtown Chicago where a lot of wine and appetizers involved, in which you were like, we want it to be effervescent. We want it to be sparkling.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes when I have conversations with organizations or brands or businesses who want to start a podcast, they kind of just want to do interviews and that's it. And they don't have a more creative idea for what the podcast can actually be. And I think that you have allowed for a lot of creativity and a lot of space within the podcast to let it kind of take on a life of its own.
That's because of you. I mean, I feel like Key Change is the three of us. And well, really, the four of us, because Cabby, it's all four of our personalities that really have contributed to its identity. Wouldn't you say? I don't think people know what a producer and engineer really do.
No, the real foundation of it all, too, is taking the time to storyboard every single episode, which takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of mental capacity to really kind of needle everything together. I mean, the diversity episodes that we did, I see at the table episodes for our most current season. I mean, we had 10, 11 different interviews that you had to weave in and out and make this cohesive story. Then we did VO over that to try to tie everything in again. And then we added music to that. And then we
packaged it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I was actually thinking about this the other night. Every episode goes through at least 7 or 8 different, almost like mini steps, versions, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're not willing or prepared to put that time in, you're not going to have the product that you're looking for. Yeah, we could easily have just done a ton of interviews and plopped them up on the internet, but we're trying to tell a story.
And some of that fine tuning is like 12 seconds.
Oh, yeah. It's like nitpicky. I mean, I remember one time I asked you if you could take an out of, that's literally like a millisecond. But because we took it out, that whole entire section just felt like a little more, flowed a little bit better,
And also what I wanted to say, Andrea, is you're welcome. I'm so glad we brought
sources
of creativity. But you brought so much. I've said this to you, your intelligence, your sense of humor, and your passion. I can't laud you enough. I mean, it's so much fun to work with you. And I feel like we just won the podcast lottery in finding you as a producer and that you got what we were saying. And you weren't like, oh boy, they're like.
We are the perfect team, especially with what you had to work with at the beginning with us, where we just had a slew of conversations recorded.
With a lot of content before you came on board.
With a lot of ideas, but because we were able to take Andrea's ideas and my ideas and Cabby's ideas and your ideas, and we were really able to flow out, okay, why are we doing this in the first place? We know we want to do it. And we know it would be really great if we did it.
Because our thing was called All Voices, Opera for All Voices. It's like, what better way to tell our story than to let everybody tell our story with us?
But I think what we were still working on in the beginning is how we tell the story. So in all honesty, it was a relationship that was at the jump was going to be
even without
perfect.
The wine.
Yeah. And it's been great.
And so how did you even land on the idea of a podcast? First of all, explain for our listeners. I like how you say that in your episodes. For our listeners, give a little bit of context of what Opera for All Voices is. And then within that, why a podcast? Where did the idea come from?
Opera for All Voices, or OFAV, as we refer to it often, is a consortium of 7 opera companies that came together to address this deficit in our art form around works that were really interesting and engaging, telling great stories, but they were shorter in length, less expensive, and somewhat portable. I mean, the word we use a lot is nimble. And so this consortium basically of opera educators or people working in community engagement kind of went rogue a little bit. And we created this thing together. So in naming it, we came up with All Voices because we wanted to represent different stories. And we wanted to represent diversity in who was telling these different stories. And we wanted to see that same diversification in our audience. Well, I love podcasts, and I think it's a wonderful format for storytelling. I find it as nimble and as engaging as what we hope to accomplish with Opera for All Voices. And one day I was thinking, oh, it was kind of like peanut butter and chocolate, the Reese's peanut butter moment. It's like, oh, podcasts, I love podcasts. Oh, All Voices. Wait a minute. Podcast, voices, all voices. We need a podcast. And I came to Brad and I said, so let's make a podcast.
We had received a wonderful grant, and they charged us with finding out a different way.
It's an innovation grant.
Innovative on how we keep up with the changes and the flow and the conversations that are going on. So at first, when Andrea said we're going to do a podcast, I thought she was nuts. I was like, there's no way we're going to be able to pull this off. This is going to take so much time, blah, 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 blah.
Well, you often think I'm nuts, but
that's true. And what ended up happening very quickly when we start to really get down to the nitty gritty of what stories we were telling about the OFAV, it became very clear very soon that this was going to be a really great endeavor. And it's being utilized as a tool with our peers outside of the consortium, which that was the hope.
I mean, at the time, it's like you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Mm-hmm. But all the people that we've, like in season 2 in particular, that have become part of the conversation, I mean, it's like the ripple rings of like who we are and why we're doing this have just gotten...
Well, we went from season 1 interviewing around 15, 16 people to season 2 interviewing around, I don't know, 50, 60 people.
Well, and you know firsthand how much fun that was.
My bad.
Yes, Brandon sent a list of, you're coming to Santa Fe, and these are all the people that we're going to interview in 2 days. And I was like, great.
You know what, I think
because all I can think of is, and that's that much more that I'm going to have to edit because we want the episodes to be compact and tight and not have a lot of excess.
Well, and still have the integrity of that, like who that person is and their identity. And I think about, you know, the movie The Minority Report with Tom Cruise, you know, where he has all that content, all that visual content, and he's moving it around with his hands. Mm-hmm. I think of you doing that, Andrea, like with all of our content, that you're like this master manipulator. You're like, move this here. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
I mean, you've already heard how incredibly awesome I am to work with from Andrea and Brandon. So obviously, today's podcast angel is me, or more specifically, the Creative Imposter Studios. Right now, there are 2 big ways I can help you craft a podcast that stands out from the same old boring interview shows to convey the spirit, personality, and message that reflects your values and your mission most authentically. Number 1, join the Podcast Envy VIP Circle. That's VIP for very important podcaster over at thecreativeimposter.com/craft and culture. Linked in the show notes, of course, for this episode. This is for you if you are in the DIY zone but need some support. You will get a premium behind-the-scenes podcast in which I'll be discussing more about the actual process we have in place to produce Key Change, things that I've learned from the experience, and you'll be able to ask me questions about your project that I will answer on a monthly call. And right now, in the month of October 2019, I am also offering a very special fall-themed tarot card podcast plan reading when you sign up to become a VIP. Number 2 way that we can work together is for you to schedule a complimentary consultation call with me. I like to call it a virtual tea date to see how we might be able to work together one-on-one to produce and edit your show. You can go ahead and find a time to connect with me at thecreativeimposter.com/T420. That's TEA 4FOR 2020. Also linked in the show notes. The Creative Imposter Studios is not your average podcast company, and I am not your average editor. We combine the technical skill with industry experience, the passion of an artist, and the spirit of an indie podcaster to give voice 2, the creative potential for your show so you can enjoy the process as much as the incredible finished product. So what has the process been like for you to start with this idea? Okay, we want to have a podcast. And before you hired me for season 1, you had already recorded these various interviews with people who were working on the behind the scenes of OFAV, some of the other group members, some of the other opera companies who were involved. And then we shaped that season a little bit more from what we had, and we recorded some more content. And then season 2 came and we did a lot more planning on the front end. What has been surprising to you? What has been most challenging? What's been your favorite part of this?
For me, the most challenging has been the time commitment. I think when you get into this work and really want to do it right, you spend way more time than you had ever anticipated. I mean, I usually listen to each episode
7 times.
At least
7.
Well, because I'm doing the music.
I mean, that's something that we should say too, Brandon, because I know that from my end, in my circle, in my network, people often are commenting on the music and saying, where's all this music coming from?
You do a really
music?
wonderful job, Brandon. You've got a skill.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It really does lend a lot to the feeling and the movement of the episodes. And when I think about if I were to go through and try to find all these different musical clips for the episodes, I think that it would take me days.
and sometimes the turnover is literally 12 hours. And it's like, I need 10 pieces. I'm like, okay, I'm on it.
But you get like in the zone.
Yeah, I do get in the zone. I just put my headphones on and I usually will have the music website that we use, just podcastmusic.com. And they're awesome. They have, all kinds of stuff. It's crazy. And then I'll have the mix down of our episode on another screen. And I will just be playing things over different changeovers and stopping it because we've worked together so long now that I know like, oh, she'll add this for like 5 seconds or this will need a little more time and blah, blah, blah. So I can kind of guess a little bit where that's going to go. But scoring like a small episode takes me at least 2.5 hours. And I think the episodes that we did, the diversity episodes, episode 2 and 3 of our last season, I think each of them took me probably around 4 to 5. And that's just because I felt like every episode has to have a different vibe, a different feel, a different mood. Even though they're interconnected, some of them, they have to breathe a different way.
It's almost like opera. You've created motives throughout these 2 seasons of Key Change. Like there's a gusty motive and there is EDI motive, essentially. And then there's a hope motive, I would say.
And the way I pick music, which we've never really discussed this, but the way I pick music is I really listen to what the person is saying. So if they end the phrase and they say it's fantastic or it's exceptional or blah, 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 I literally just type that word in my thesaurus online and start searching for those key words to find the music that I feel best fits. A lot of people who listen to it know the podcast is very heavily influenced by jazz and hip hop and a lot of folk music because I thought it was very important for OFAV being an American-led group about American composers to also highlight other very American
you got some
genres.
Stravinsky in there too.
There's tons of classical
18th century.
For sure.
Beethoven.
Of course. Because we can't lose that identity. We're still classical.
What's our bedrock?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I didn't want it to be a podcast that was purely centered on the classical foundation of opera. I wanted it to feel wholly American.
I think that you said that too early on when we were having conversations about the direction of the podcast and the direction we wanted it to go, is that we didn't just want people who already love opera to listen to it. We wanted the podcast itself to speak to other people who may be new to the field of opera or who may not be as well versed. And so we wanted that accessibility. And I think that by incorporating in different musical genres, you're really putting some context, some cultural context that a wider audience can relate to.
Right. Well, like our theme music, for example, is composed by Renee Orth, who is the composer in residence at Opera Philadelphia, American composer, a beautiful, cool
new generation,
a very close connection to Andrea and I. And we thought that was a must. Like we had to have that kind of flavor. And the first piece that we play in the whole piece itself, I think it's actually the overture to Magic Flute. But the second piece is that really funky hip opera of Carmen kind of vibe.
The habanero.
Habanero. And when I heard that piece,
it kind of has that loping sound to it, like Renee's music.
That has influenced every musical decision, because I realize that we do have to be different and we do have to give a different vibe. You know, I want everything to have that energy and that drive. And being a musician myself and music being so close to my heart, I really wanted the music to help the narrative of every episode. And that takes time, and that takes, I think, a little passion around that.
Well, and I don't know how much our listeners are aware that that's kind of why our vibe, Brandon, not just because we're two different generations, we're male and female, we come from different backgrounds, but I'm a words person and he's a music person. So we're like the perfect synergy, like what opera is he's music and I'm words. And I think that's part of why that works for us in terms of our dynamic.
Yeah, I know we've gone on a total tangent from the
you're like, what did you enjoy most?
What I find challenging is also what I enjoy most.
Right.
Yeah, and when you get to know these people that you're interviewing, and I'm not full synesthetic at all, but when I'm sitting in an interview and I'm listening, I really do feel the color and the energy in that conversation. And that's something that I find the most difficult thing to do and my favorite thing to do at the same time.
That also comes up, Andrea, and when Brandon and I are doing voiceover, Brandon will say, oh my God, that we're so serious. You know, it's like, we got to lighten this up, because a lot of the things we're talking about do have a heaviness to them. However, we're not suggesting that people like tomorrow, you know, take action and try to change the world. Although we do think you can change the world through opera. We say that a lot, but that we feel that with each other as well. And that, I think that's also one of the challenges. How do we talk about things that are real and substantial without bringing everybody down?
And I think that you do that really well in the way that you play off of each other. And I've often thought about that in terms of producing podcasts with other people or other groups. Who is going to be the voice or voices of this show, and how are those voices going to resonate as
you did a Brandonism.
Characters? Right? How are those voices going to resonate as characters? You know, because you literally are the voices in other people's heads now.
Right.
And so how do we make sure that you're not just a representative of an organization, in this case, the Santa Fe Opera, delivering information to the listener, but that you actually are entertaining the listeners, and you actually are building rapport with the listeners, even though it's not in real time. You know, like in a stage performance, obviously you have that interaction with the audience that we talk about a lot in this season. That's in real time. But in this case, it's time shifted. You're here in the studio now talking to each other, having this conversation, but how does that feel immediate and vital? And how does that create character? And I think that one of the interesting things about the way the two of you work is very early on in the process, we tried to script things.
Right. Oh, remember that.
and now there's this sort of improvisational quality that the two of you play off of each other's energy, and that works in a really great dynamic.
I think it's exactly that. It is improv. You give us prompts and we play, and it's a lot of yes and in terms of our conversation. Neither one of us is like, I don't think so, trying to shut the other one down. But if I may just back up a little bit, back to like thinking about the voice and I didn't intend to be on the podcast. I don't know if you remember. I wanted you to be the host. And then just in terms of like what we were trying to accomplish, and again, this all voices and having different perspectives, it just started to feel like we needed the two of us. It
needed to be a team.
Yeah.
Also, just to throw it in there too, you know, if you're going to do a podcast with a colleague and have a co-host situation, I think it has to be built on a foundation of a lot of honesty. And there might be times that Andrea and I might not agree with what the other has said, but we allow that person to speak their truth and to say what they want. Or there might be times that I have said something that Andrea was like, I wouldn't have done it that way, or vice versa. But you allow people to be themselves. And when I come into the booth and when we're doing the podcast, the last thing I think about is being a part of the Santa Fe Opera.
Right.
I think about, and I'm not saying that because I'm not so proud to be connected and affiliated and to be on staff here.
The POV is us.
Yeah.
It's Brandon and Andrea.
Yeah, it's not the Santa Fe Opera. The Santa Fe Opera is writing that check, but and paying for us to be here and helping us create what I hope people have received as a really cathartic and wonderful experience. It has been for us. But at the same time, if you go into it worrying about what people are going to think or people are going to say or what people are going to feel about stuff, you know, RuPaul says this quote all the time. He says, "Your opinion about me is none of my business." And that's how I think we've kind of approached this. We have very open conversations. We talk about things in our perspective. They're not the opera's perspective. They're our perspective.
We're certainly mindful that the Santa Fe Opera is underneath everything that we're saying.
We're not cursing all the way through the podcast.
No, that we left it to somebody else.
Talking about anything inappropriate, you know.
And how do you think, I mean, that's a good question too, is how do you think that the work that you're doing through OFAV, but then more specifically through Key Change, supports the greater mission of the Santa Fe Opera? I mean, have you gotten any specific feedback from administration, from leadership?
We've started quite a few conversations at work. Good.
it makes, I think by and large, we've gotten really enthusiastic, appreciative feedback from our leadership at the opera and also from our board of directors and artists. I mean, and people associated with the company that are our peers are
loving it. I mean, I'm just getting texts about our Peter Sellers interview, and people are saying like, "Oh my God, that's such a great interview," and blah blah blah. Blah.
That being said, there are some people that have been not made uncomfortable, but have said to me that what we're talking about it makes them uncomfortable, and particularly in season 2. Season 1 was like, "Hey, this is this thing we're doing. We want you to know about it," and season 2, it's like, "Okay, here's this thing that we're doing. We want you to know about it, and we want you to know why we're doing it and why it matters and what we're doing differently." And that's hard for people to hear because then they feel like they're being called out, like they failed.
And I have to commend our leadership for allowing us to have that room and the breath to say what we need to say. I mean,
leadership during a transitional time. I mean, with our previous general director, Charles McKay, and now with Robert Maya.
Exactly. And this atmosphere and what we're doing and how we're approaching it allows opera to feel a little less stuffy to other people. That's something I have heard, and people feel more connected that these conversations are going on. And this kind of like lifts up the veil a little bit. And I think we'll be pushing the curtain, yes. And we'll be pushing that a little bit further going forward because that's the whole purpose of this podcast is to allow people the opportunity to have that insider view. And it's not an insider view with like, you know, some like curtain over it. I mean, it's really... And universally, everyone we've talked to, they're not unlike us. They love what we do in this environment where we make art. They're passionate about it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you asked about what has been surprising or exciting. That's what I just really love talking to people about this thing that I love so much and I can go on for, but to stop and listen and hear other people talk about it. I think we've learned so much from our peers that without this opportunity, I don't know if we would have been able to build the kind of relationships we've built, especially over the last season. Yeah. Also, Brandon and I speak in podcasts now, which is super fun. Like when we're not in the studio, we can go into this like this little banter and annoy the crap out of everybody around us. Everybody in our office. They hate it. They're just jealous. They just roll their eyes and are like, "Oh man. So cute."
And so what would you say personally for you? And I know that we didn't really do a formal introduction at the beginning in terms of who you are, what you do, what is your role with Santa Fe Opera, which I can do in an intro. So that's sure, we could add totally it now fine. And you can put it wherever you're. But, right, master editing skills. But for you personally, like what has the podcast done for you, or how do you see this benefiting you personally in your career in terms of your creative process? Like how have you personally grown or changed as a result of working on this project? For me, it's pretty straightforward. It's that
because I was so naive going into this. So I have this thing in life, like people say, Andrea, you can do that. Go do that, make that happen. I'm like, okay. And I show up and I make it happen. I did not know what I was getting into in us developing Key Change together. And the personal gain for me is, oh my God, that's like a really amazing, cool thing. And forgive me for like patting myself and all of us on the back, but it's a really amazing, cool thing. And I'm a part of it. And I never anticipated that, like, okay, I'm like, we're going to do this and make this thing happen. But on the other side of like, check the box success, we made that happen. Like, but that's really like my children say to me, Mommy, you have a podcast. Brandon, you have a podcast. That's so cool, Mommy. And I'm like, you know what? That actually is kind of cool. So I think that that's the personal gain. Is just like, oh, there are things that I can do that are actually fun and playful. And they don't always have to be like, and I filed the report and I got that grant, and even like writing a libretto and things that I do that they're very satisfying for me as an artist. This has been satisfying to me in a whole different way.
Before the podcast started, and Andrea knows this, so this will not be a surprise, but I was going through a really tough time on being in the art form, opera, and was considering leaving and moving on to something else and trying to rediscover who I was, and which probably indicates my apprehension when the podcast first came up, because I was just like, whatever, you know how people are sometimes. And when we got into it and started it, I realized I was missing out on my own voice and I wasn't listening to myself. And when I actually began to start listening to myself on the podcast and talking to people and engaging with people that were listening to it, I became emboldened, honestly. And I feel like I rediscovered a part of myself that had been a bit dormant, that I had shut off for whatever reason. Yeah.
That you had a voice and your voice had power and your voice could help other people find their voices.
Well, and I used to be so intimidated by people. I realized, like, Charles McKay, who's the gentlest, nicest person in the world, the former general director of Santa Fe Opera, he always used to intimidate me. And it wasn't until
you interviewed him?
I interviewed him that all went away. And I realized that had gone away with everyone else that I interacted with. It really helped me emotionally and mentally.
And I think we can credit Andrea with that, because if I remember correctly, that was a season 1 interview. I think that she said Brandon should interview Charles.
She did.
And you were like,
Yeah, I was totally
well,
against it.
I like to push you all.
Yeah.
I do that with all of you.
And I was so, oh my God. And I was
Comfort zone. Forget it.
Cabby was there. I was so nervous. And then after about 2 minutes in, it became a conversation. And one of my favorites I've had on the podcast the last 2 seasons.
What advice do you have for someone who is part of a nonprofit organization or a social impact organization who is considering starting a podcast?
Oh, one thing's super easy for me, because that's, if you're considering doing it, just capture content. Even before you know what it's going to be, if you have people around that you want to be part of that story and that narrative, just start interviewing them. And just like save it. Just have content ready to go. I think that's one of the smartest things we did. That what we said, we're going to do this thing.
It's true.
We just started interviewing people and talking to people. So we had stuff in the can.
Because you'll figure it out. It might take some time, but you'll figure it out.
Which I know is kind of like, but it's like, if you build it, they will come. Build it by, have content. And then for us, I think the narrative started to come into shape from there. What would you say?
I would say make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, because it is a time commitment. It's not something, if you're looking for like some bit of fame or
not a short
trivial,
time,
don't do it, because it's really not worth it. But if you have something to say and you have a perspective that you want to share, that you feel is important, whether you think people are going to listen to you or not, have faith in yourself and trust that your voice is important and make it happen, and just be prepared to work. I mean, there have been some nights where Andrea and I are emailing each other back and forth at like 2:00 in the morning, and sometimes you have these quick turnarounds, or Andrea and I will be going back and forth. I mean, we had one episode we edited at least 7 or 8 times. And I know everyone's being driven crazy about it, but we were so proud of the product. Be prepared to put a lot of work and time and make sure you're ready to do that.
But have fun too. I mean,
for sure.
One of the joys of this work has been the joy of this work. I mean, we do have fun.
We do have a good time. And the relationships you build through it
Through those
are
conversations.
so unexpected. Even if it's just that one conversation, you and that person are connected in a way that you don't expect. And I think that's really the beauty of just talking to people. We don't talk to each other enough.
Yeah, it's that talking and listening. Again, it's been the great revelation for me. I can't say it enough.
Yeah.
Last question. Is there anything else that you want to share that I didn't ask or that we didn't
Such
talk
a
about?
good interviewer. Oh my gosh. Andrea's always reminding us to say that at the end of our interviews. Surprise! I don't know. I mean, I think I've said it, Andrea. It's the success of this podcast, which I do believe it's quite successful. It's you and Cabby and all the people who've said yes when we said we want to talk to you. It took all of us to make this thing what it is. And that's the only other thing I'd want to say is thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And be bold. Be daring.
Know your voice.
Know your voice. Even if you don't really know who you are in the moment, really push, really challenge yourself to ask hard questions and find your rhythm and find your space. I mean, even now, Andrea and I, we laugh at some of the earlier episodes where we feel like a little too robotic or something like that. You know, it will all come to you. You just got to give yourself time and enjoy it.
Because, yeah, that's the whole thing, though. It is, you are finding your voice.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we both did.
Right.
So
it's the meaning of the podcast, right?
Yeah.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.